The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned airfield maintenance hangar, where dust motes danced in shafts of golden light streaming through broken windows. General Marcus Blackwood had come here seeking solitude, a place to escape the suffocating weight of his Pentagon office and the endless parade of briefings about budget cuts and force restructuring. At 62, he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades in uniform, his silver hair cropped military short, his dress blues adorned with ribbons that told stories of conflicts spanning 3 continents. But as he stepped through the hangar's rusted doorway, expecting emptiness, he froze. There, seated cross-legged on a canvas tarp spread across the oil-stained concrete, was a woman methodically field-stripping an M4 carbine. Her movements were fluid, practiced, each motion executed with the muscle memory that only comes from thousands of repetitions. She appeared to be in her early 30s, auburn hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that revealed lean, corded arms marked by the kind of scars that spoke of close calls and hard landings. What stopped Blackwood's breath wasn't her presence, though. It was the tattoo on her left shoulder blade, visible as she leaned forward to examine the rifle's bolt carrier group. The ink was faded but unmistakable, a stylized eagle clutching lightning bolts, wings spread wide with the numbers 442 emblazoned beneath. The insignia of the 442nd Tactical Fighter Squadron, his squadron. The unit that had been disbanded 15 years ago after a mission that officially never happened, in a place that didn't exist on any map. The woman sensed his presence and looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a directness that made him feel suddenly exposed. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that tugged at memories he'd spent years trying to bury. She didn't seem surprised to see a general in full dress uniform standing in her makeshift workshop, didn't scramble to attention or offer the reflexive "sir" that usually followed such encounters. Instead, she simply nodded once, a slight acknowledgement, and returned to her work. Her fingers moved with surgical precision as she reassembled the weapon, each component sliding into place with barely audible clicks. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of shared but unrecognized history. Blackwood found himself studying her more intently, searching for clues in the way she held her shoulders, the particular cant of her head as she sighted down the rifle's barrel. Something about her posture, her economy of movement, whispered of cockpit hours and stick time, of someone who had lived in the three-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. The morning light shifted, illuminating more details. Dog tags hanging from a chain around her neck, a faded Air Force PT shirt draped over a nearby crate, and most tellingly, a worn leather jacket bearing the unmistakable patches of a fighter pilot. But it was the call sign embroidered above the left breast pocket that made his world tilt. Ghost. Every pilot in the 442nd had known about Ghost, the legend, the phantom, the one who had vanished during their final mission over the Hindu Kush. Official records listed her as KIA, body never recovered, next of kin notified. But here she was, very much alive, cleaning weapons in an abandoned hangar like some kind of warrior monk maintaining her tools of war. The impossibility of it should have made him question his sanity, but the evidence was undeniable. She finished reassembling the rifle and set it aside, finally looking up at him again. This time, her expression carried a flicker of recognition, as if she too was placing pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across time and classified files. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the gravelly undertone of someone who had breathed too much smoke and sand. General Blackwood. It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who he was, had probably known from the moment he'd stepped into her sanctuary. It's been a long time. The words hit him like a physical blow. This was indeed Captain Elena "Ghost" Vasquez, the pilot who had been his squadron's most gifted aviator, the one who could make an F-16 dance like a hummingbird in a hurricane, the one whose supposed death had haunted him for 15 years, whose name was engraved on a black granite memorial wall in a classified cemetery that didn't officially exist. Elena. Her name came out as barely a whisper, carrying 15 years of guilt, grief, and unanswered questions. We thought you were dead. The memorial service, the flag ceremony, your parents. He trailed off, overwhelmed by the impossibility of the moment. She stood slowly, her movements betraying a subtle stiffness that spoke of old injuries imperfectly healed. I was dead, Marcus, for a while at least, dead to everyone who mattered anyway. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that somehow made it worse. The hangar around them seemed to fade away as Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. If Ghost was alive, then everything he thought he knew about that final mission, about the losses they'd sustained, about the reasons for the squadron's disbandment, was wrong. The official after-action reports, the classified debriefs, the carefully constructed narrative that had allowed him to sleep at night, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. The mission, he began, then stopped, unsure how much he could say, how much she already knew. Operation Nightfall, she supplied, her eyes never leaving his face. September 15, 2009. My wingman was Captain Torres, call sign Maverick. We were tasked with eliminating a high-value target in a compound 30 clicks northeast of Kandahar. Intel suggested minimal air defenses, routine strike mission. Blackwood nodded slowly. That matched the official version, at least the parts that weren't still buried under classification stamps and redacted paragraphs. But he remembered the real intelligence briefing, the one that had painted a very different picture of what they were sending his pilots into. She picked up a cleaning rod and began running it through the rifle barrel, the methodical action seeming to help her organize her thoughts. What they didn't tell us was that the compound was a trap. Someone had fed our intelligence network false information, set up the whole thing as an elaborate kill box designed specifically for American fast movers. The words confirmed Blackwood's worst fears about that mission. He had suspected, had pushed back against the mission parameters, but had ultimately been overruled by higher command authorities who insisted the intelligence was solid. The guilt he'd carried for sending his pilots into what he'd suspected was a trap came flooding back with renewed force. The SAM sites were state-of-the-art Russian hardware, not the obsolete stuff Intel had briefed, Elena continued. S-400 systems, networked and coordinated. Torres took a direct hit on our first pass, never had a chance to eject. I managed to put 2 GBU-12s on target before they painted me with enough radar to light up a Christmas tree. Blackwood remembered the radio intercepts from that night, the brief burst of tactical chatter before Ghost's transponder had gone dark. The search and rescue operation had lasted 72 hours, combing every square mile of hostile territory in a desperate attempt to find survivors. They'd found wreckage from both aircraft, scattered across a valley floor that had been swept clean by the autumn winds. My bird took catastrophic damage, Elena said, her voice taking on the clipped, professional tone of a pilot delivering a mission debrief. Hydraulics gone, flight controls shot to hell, engine running on fumes and prayer. I managed to nurse her about 20 miles east before physics finally won the argument. She paused in her cleaning, her eyes growing distant as she revisited that night. The ejection sequence was compromised. Seat fired late, too low, too fast. Landed hard in terrain that wasn't supposed to exist according to our maps, deep canyon system, caves that went back for miles. Took me 3 days to realize nobody was coming to look for me there. The matter-of-fact way she described what must have been a terrifying ordeal struck Blackwood as quintessentially Elena. She had always been the pilot who could compartmentalize fear, who could find solutions in situations that would paralyze others. It was what had made her such an effective combat aviator, and apparently what had kept her alive when survival should have been impossible. The locals found me first, she continued. Pashtun nomads who had been moving through those mountains for generations. They had no love for the Taliban, but they also understood that helping an American pilot came with serious risks. Blackwood found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about the squadron's final mission. The woman before him was both exactly as he remembered and utterly transformed, as if 15 years of assumed death had crystallized her into something harder and more essential. She set down the cleaning rod and looked directly at him. "They kept me hidden for 6 months while I healed from injuries that should have killed me twice over. Broken back, ruptured spleen, traumatic brain injury that left me with gaps in my memory that still haven't come back. By the time I was functional enough to attempt contact with friendly forces, the war had moved on." The implications of her words hit him like a physical blow. While they had been conducting memorial services and notifying next of kin, Alina had been fighting for her life in caves that didn't appear on any satellite imagery, protected by people who owed her nothing, but chose to risk everything for a stranger who had fallen from the sky. "I tried to make contact through back channels," she said, returning to her methodical weapon maintenance. "But every feeler I put out came back with the same message. Captain Alina Vasquez was officially dead, the 442nd was disbanded, and any attempt to surface would compromise ongoing operations." Blackwood felt the weight of command decisions made 15 years ago settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The pressure to close the books on failed missions, to move on from losses that couldn't be officially acknowledged, to maintain the fiction that American military operations were surgical and precise. He remembered the classified briefings, the suggestions that pursuing search and rescue operations in denied territory might jeopardize more important strategic objectives. "They burned us," Alina said simply, her words cutting through his memories like a blade. "The mission was compromised from the start, Tors died for nothing, and when I inconveniently survived, it became easier to leave me dead than to explain why 2 of America's finest pilots had been sent into a kill box." The accusation hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. As squadron commander, Blackwood bore ultimate responsibility for the mission that had cost them 2 aircraft and officially 2 lives. The fact that Alina had survived didn't absolve him of the guilt. If anything, it made it worse by proving that abandonment had been a choice rather than a necessity. She reassembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, each component sliding into place with mechanical precision. "I spent 2 years moving through networks of smugglers and refugees, trading skills for passage, learning languages that aren't taught at the Defense Language Institute. Made it as far as Morocco before I realized that home wasn't a place I could go back to." Her hands moved over the weapon with the same fluid confidence he remembered from watching her pre-flight F-16s on dawn patrol missions. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she maintained her equipment, as if the repetitive actions helped her process memories that were too large and sharp to handle directly. "The woman who ejected from that Falcon over Afghanistan died in those mountains," Alina continued. "What came out was something different, something that understood how easily the system discards its own when it becomes inconvenient to acknowledge their existence." Blackwood found himself studying her face, looking for traces of the young captain who had been the squadron's rising star 15 years ago. The bone structure was the same, the green eyes still held their intelligence and intensity, but there was a hardness now that hadn't been there before, a wariness that spoke of too many betrayals and too few second chances. "So you became a ghost in truth," he said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I became what I needed to become," she replied. "Learned skills that aren't taught at pilot training, made connections in places that don't appear on official maps. The dead have certain advantages in the shadow economy: no paper trail, no official existence to compromise, no next of kin to notify if things go wrong." The rifle stood propped against a nearby crate, ready for action but temporarily at rest. Alina picked up a sidearm from her collection, a well-maintained Sig Sauer P226 that showed the kind of wear that comes from daily carry and regular use. Her movements as she began field stripping the pistol were just as fluid and practiced as they had been with the rifle. "What have you been doing all these years?" Blackwood asked, though he suspected the answer would be both fascinating and terrible. Alina's eyes flicked up from the disassembled pistol, meeting his gaze with an expression that was both amused and sad. "Freelance problem-solving for clients who value discretion over paperwork. Sometimes for people who used to wear the same uniform I did, sometimes for their enemies. The world turns out to be more complicated than they teach you at the academy." The admission should have shocked him, but somehow it didn't. If the system had abandoned her, if officially she didn't exist, then the normal rules of loyalty and allegiance no longer applied. She had become something outside the traditional frameworks of military service, operating in the gray spaces where official policy met practical necessity. "There's a whole community of us out there," she continued, her voice taking on a tone of matter-of-fact explanation. "Operators who fell through the cracks, who were burned by their handlers, who discovered that their service records had been classified out of existence. We look out for each other in ways that the official system never could." Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air flowing through the broken hangar windows. How many others were there? How many soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines had been discarded by the same system that had created them, left to find their own way in a world that had officially declared them dead? "The tattoo," he said, nodding toward her shoulder. "Why keep it if everything else was burned?" Alina's hands paused in their work on the pistol, and for the first time since he'd entered the hangar, her professional composure cracked slightly. "Because some things are worth remembering, even when they hurt. The 442nd was the best squadron I ever served with, and the men and women I flew with deserved better than what happened to them." The weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. She was right, of course. The squadron had been exceptional, filled with pilots who had been handpicked for their skill, dedication, and ability to operate in the gray areas where conventional military doctrine met political necessity. They had been his responsibility, his family in all the ways that mattered, and he had failed them. "Tors had a daughter," Alina said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind through the broken windows. "Maria. She would be 22 now, probably graduated from college. I send money to her education fund every year, anonymously. Dead pilots can't write checks, but ghosts can move money in ways that don't leave traces." The simple humanity of the gesture hit Blackwood harder than any accusation could have. While he had been climbing the ranks, accumulating stars and responsibilities, Alina had been honoring the memory of her wingman in the most direct way possible, ensuring that his sacrifice had meaning beyond the classified files and redacted reports. She finished reassembling the pistol and set it aside, her collection of weapons now clean and ready. The ritual seemed to have served its purpose, providing structure and focus for a conversation that was reshaping everything he thought he understood about duty, loyalty, and the true cost of military service. "Why are you here?" Blackwood asked. "In this hangar, I mean. This isn't exactly a coincidence." Alina's smile was thin and knowing. "Because tomorrow morning, you're scheduled to give a speech at the Air Force Academy about leadership and sacrifice. Because that speech is going to include a reference to the brave pilots who gave their lives serving their country in classified operations. Because I wanted to see if you still believed the official version of what happened to us." The words hit him like a slap. His prepared remarks for the Academy ceremony did indeed include a section about fallen heroes, carefully crafted language that honored sacrifice while revealing nothing about the missions that had claimed those lives. It was the kind of speech he had given dozens of times, honoring the dead while protecting the living from uncomfortable truths. "You've been watching me," he realized. "I've been watching everyone connected to Operation Nightfall," Alina confirmed. 15 years is a long time to nurse a grudge, but some things are worth the wait. Besides, dead pilots have all the time in the world." The hangar around them seemed to grow smaller as the implications of her presence became clear. This wasn't a chance encounter or a coincidence. Alina had orchestrated this meeting, had maneuvered events to bring him to this place at this time, for reasons that were becoming increasingly ominous. "What do you want?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would change everything. Alina stood and walked to the hangar's main opening, where morning light streamed in to illuminate the abandoned airfield beyond. Her silhouette against the bright sky reminded him powerfully of the young pilot she had been, standing beside her F-16 before a mission briefing, ready to take on whatever the enemy could throw at her. "I want the truth," she said without turning around. "All of it. Who compromised the mission, who made the decision to leave me dead, and who profited from the cover-up that followed. 15 years is long enough for justice to wait." The morning sun climbed higher above the abandoned airfield, its light streaming through the hangar's broken windows to illuminate the space where two old comrades faced each other across a chasm of 15 years and a lifetime of unanswered questions. General Marcus Blackwood stood motionless, his dress uniform a stark contrast to the industrial decay around them, while Alina Vasquez remained silhouetted against the bright opening, her presence both familiar and transformed. "The truth," Blackwood repeated, the words carrying the weight of classified briefings and redacted files. "Alina, you have to understand the complexity of what happened. The geopolitical implications, the ongoing operations that could have been compromised." She turned from the hangar opening, her green eyes reflecting a hardness that hadn't been there 15 years ago. Complexity. That's always the excuse, isn't it? When people in uniforms make mistakes that cost lives, it's never simple negligence or cowardice. It's always complexity. The accusation hung between them like cordite smoke, acrid and persistent. Blackwood found himself remembering the classified after-action briefings, the careful parsing of blame, the way responsibility had been distributed among so many decision-makers that no single person could be held accountable for the catastrophic intelligence failure that had sent Alina and Tors into a kill box. "Tell me about Colonel Morrison," Alina said, her voice carrying the conversational tone of someone asking about the weather. But Blackwood felt his blood turn to ice water. Morrison's name had been buried so deep in classified files that even thinking about it felt like a security violation. "How do you know about Morrison?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina's smile held no warmth. "Dead pilots hear things that live ones aren't supposed to. Morrison was the intelligence liaison for Operation Nightfall, wasn't he? The one who vouched for the quality of the human intelligence that placed that high-value target in the compound." Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. If Alina knew about Morrison's role, then she knew about the subsequent investigation, the one that had been classified at levels that required special clearances even to acknowledge its existence. Morrison had been quietly transferred to a desk job at Offutt Air Force Base, his career effectively ended but his pension intact, his silence purchased with the promise of a comfortable retirement. "Morrison was compromised," Alina continued, beginning to pace slowly around the hangar's perimeter. "The intelligence he was feeding to mission planners was coming from sources that had been turned by enemy handlers. Every detail about that compound, every assessment of its defensive capabilities, every piece of tactical intelligence was carefully crafted to draw American aircraft into a predetermined kill zone." The precision of her knowledge was terrifying. These were details that existed only in the most classified after-action reports, investigations that had been conducted by agencies whose names were themselves classified. If Alina had access to this level of intelligence, it meant her network of contacts extended far beyond what he had imagined. "The question," she said, stopping directly in front of him, "is whether Morrison was an unwitting dupe or an active participant in what happened to my squadron." Blackwood felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had suspected Morrison's intelligence was flawed, had raised concerns during the mission planning sessions, but had ultimately been overruled by higher authority. The pressure to conduct offensive operations, to show results in a war that was increasingly unpopular with the American public, had created an environment where questionable intelligence was accepted because it promised actionable targets. The investigation concluded that Morrison was negligent but not treasonous, Blackwood said carefully. His sources had been compromised without his knowledge, and he failed to properly verify their intelligence before passing it up the chain of command. Alina's laugh was sharp and bitter. Negligent but not treasonous. How convenient. A classification that allows everyone to sleep better at night while Tor's molders in his grave and I spend 15 years learning to be someone else. The hangar around them seemed to absorb sound, creating an acoustic environment that made their conversation feel isolated from the rest of the world. Blackwood found himself acutely aware of Alina's weapons collection, neatly arranged and meticulously maintained, tools of a trade that existed in the shadows between official policy and practical necessity. "There's something else you need to know about Morrison," Alina said, her voice dropping to a tone that made his skin crawl. "He didn't retire to that desk job at Offutt. 3 months after the investigation concluded, he was found dead in his home, apparent suicide. Single gunshot to the head, service weapon, no note." The revelation hit Blackwood like a physical blow. Morrison's death had never been reported through official channels, at least not at his level. If Alina was telling the truth, it meant that someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that the intelligence officer's silence would be permanent. "Suicide," she continued, "or something made to look like suicide. Either way, it eliminated the one person who could definitively answer whether the intelligence failures that killed Tors were accidental or intentional." Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. If Morrison had been murdered, it suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple intelligence failures. It implied that Operation Nightfall had been compromised at levels that went to the very heart of American military operations, and that powerful people had been willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. Alina's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. "More people than you might think, fewer than you might fear. The shadow community has its own intelligence networks, its own ways of sharing information that official channels would rather keep buried." She walked back to her collection of weapons, running her fingers along the rifle's barrel with the same careful attention she had once given to pre-flight inspections of her F-16. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Both were tools of war. Both required meticulous maintenance to function when lives depended on them. "The real question," Alina said without looking up, "is what you're prepared to do with the information I'm giving you. Are you going to add it to the classified files and hope it stays buried, or are you going to help me find out who really killed Morrison and why?" The morning light streaming through the hangar windows had shifted, creating new patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to emphasize the surreal nature of their encounter. Blackwood felt as if he were standing at a crossroads, with one path leading back to the comfortable certainties of his official position, and the other disappearing into a darkness that might well consume what remained of his career and reputation. "Help you how?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Alina looked up from her weapons, her green eyes holding an intensity that reminded him powerfully of the pilot she had been 15 years ago, focused and determined, and absolutely fearless in the face of impossible odds. "By using your access and authority to get answers that someone has spent 15 years trying to keep buried," she said. "By remembering that the oath you took was to support and defend the Constitution, not to protect the careers of people who got good soldiers killed through negligence or worse." The words struck him like a physical blow, carrying the weight of every compromise he had made in the name of military necessity, every uncomfortable truth he had allowed to remain buried in the name of operational security. She was asking him to choose between loyalty to the institution that had defined his entire adult life and loyalty to the principles that institution was supposed to serve. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Alina's smile was sad and knowing. "Then tomorrow morning, you'll give your speech about leadership and sacrifice to a room full of future officers who still believe that their country will never abandon them. And maybe that's enough. Maybe some truths are too dangerous to uncover." But even as she spoke the words, Blackwood could see in her eyes that she didn't believe them any more than he did. Some truths, once glimpsed, demanded to be pursued regardless of the cost. The question was whether he still had the courage to follow that pursuit wherever it might lead. The hangar fell silent except for the whisper of wind through broken windows and the distant sound of aircraft from the active runway several miles away. Two old soldiers stood facing each other across a divide that was measured not in distance, but in the accumulated weight of compromises, secrets, and choices that could never be undone. Blackwood found himself thinking about the young officers he was scheduled to address the next morning, their faces bright with the same idealism that had once driven him to volunteer for the most dangerous missions his service could offer. What would he tell them about leadership, when his own leadership had failed the people who depended on him most? What would he tell them about sacrifice, when he wasn't sure he had the courage to sacrifice his own comfortable position for the sake of truth? "There's a coffee shop in Georgetown," Alina said quietly, breaking the silence. "Uncommon Grounds on Wisconsin Avenue. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock after your speech. If you decide you want to know the whole truth about what happened to the 442nd, meet me there." She began collecting her weapons, moving with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to breaking down and relocating on short notice. Each piece of equipment disappeared into a well-organized kit bag, leaving no trace of her presence except for the faint scent of gun oil and the memories of a conversation that had changed everything. "Alina," Blackwood called as she shouldered her equipment bag. "If this is as big as you're suggesting, if there really was a conspiracy that went beyond Morrison's intelligence failures, then approaching it directly could get us both killed." She paused at the hangar entrance, silhouetted once again against the bright morning sky. "Marcus, people like us were already dead the moment we put on the uniform. The only question is whether we die for something that means something, or whether we die in our sleep years from now, never knowing whether we had the courage to do what was right when it mattered most." And then she was gone, disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings and rusted aircraft that surrounded the old airfield. Blackwood stood alone in the hangar, surrounded by the ghosts of conversations and memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline sky that reminded Blackwood of the perfect flying whether he had experienced during his own pilot training decades earlier. The Air Force Academy's cadet chapel gleamed white against the Colorado mountains, its soaring spires reaching toward heaven like the prayers of young men and women preparing to dedicate their lives to something larger than themselves. General Blackwood stood at the podium in the Academy's main auditorium, looking out at nearly 1,000 cadets arranged in perfect formation, their dress uniforms immaculate, their faces bright with the confidence that came from believing they were part of something noble and important. He had given variations of this speech dozens of times before, carefully crafted words about duty, honor, and sacrifice that were designed to inspire without revealing the more uncomfortable truths about military service. "Leadership," he began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium's advanced sound system, "is not about giving orders or making decisions from the safety of a command bunker. Leadership is about taking responsibility for the lives entrusted to your care, about making hard choices when there are no good options, about living with the consequences of those choices long after the mission is complete." The words felt different in his mouth today, carrying weight and meaning that hadn't been there in previous iterations of the speech. He found himself thinking about Alina, about Tors, about Morrison, and the unanswered questions that surrounded his death. These young faces looking up at him deserved better than the sanitized version of military service that was typically presented at such ceremonies. Some of you will serve in conflicts that are officially acknowledged, where your service will be recognized and your sacrifices honored in ceremonies like this one, he continued. Others will serve in places that don't appear on maps, in operations that will never be declassified, fighting enemies who officially don't exist. For those officers, the only recognition may be the knowledge that they did their duty when their country needed them most. He paused, scanning the faces in the audience, seeing in them the same eager idealism that had driven him to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments his service could offer. But he also saw something else now, a recognition that military service involved more than just following orders and trusting the system to take care of its own. But leadership also means questioning orders that don't make sense, pushing back against intelligence that seems flawed, and never allowing political expedience to override your responsibility to the men and women under your command, Blackwood said, his voice gaining strength and conviction. It means remembering that your first loyalty is always to the Constitution and the principles it represents, not to the careers of senior officials or the convenience of political leaders. A murmur ran through the audience, cadets exchanging glances as they recognized that this speech was departing from the usual script. In the balcony, Blackwood could see Academy officials shifting uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about where their guest speaker was heading. "I want to tell you about two pilots," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur to restore absolute silence. "Captain Elena Vasquez and Captain Roberto Torres, call signs Ghost and Maverick. They were members of the 442nd Tactical Fighter Squadron, a unit that was tasked with conducting precision strikes in denied territory using intelligence that later proved to be fatally flawed." The auditorium was so quiet that Blackwood could hear the ventilation system cycling, could hear the subtle rustle of fabric as nearly 1,000 cadets leaned forward in their seats. This was clearly not the kind of story usually told at Academy ceremonies, where heroism was typically presented in sanitized, inspiring packages that avoided the messier realities of military service. "Captain Torres died when his aircraft was struck by a surface-to-air missile that our intelligence had assured us wasn't there," Blackwood continued. "Captain Vasquez's aircraft was also hit, but she managed to nurse her damaged fighter 20 miles from the target before ejecting into terrain that didn't appear on our maps. She was officially listed as killed in action, and her squadron was disbanded rather than face the uncomfortable questions that might arise from a more thorough investigation." He could see Academy officials in the balcony making urgent phone calls, clearly trying to decide whether to intervene and stop a speech that was revealing classified information to an audience of future officers. But Blackwood had reached the point where political consequences mattered less than moral imperatives. "What I learned yesterday," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "is that Captain Vasquez survived. She spent 15 years believing that her country had abandoned her, learning to exist in the shadows of a world that officially considered her dead. And the intelligence failure that cost Captain Torres his life and Captain Vasquez her identity was not an accident. It was the result of systematic negligence that bordered on criminal conduct." The auditorium erupted in whispers and exclamations as cadets tried to process what they were hearing. This was not the inspiring tale of heroism and sacrifice they had expected, but rather a story about institutional failure and the human cost of political expedience. "As officers," Blackwood said, raising his voice to restore order, "you will face moments when doing the right thing conflicts with following orders, when protecting your subordinates requires challenging your superiors, when serving your country means defying the very institution that gave you authority. Those are the moments that define true leadership." He paused, letting his words sink in, looking out at faces that were no longer bright with uncomplicated idealism, but rather serious with the recognition that military service involved moral complexity that academy coursework had only hinted at. Captain Vasquez and Captain Torres deserved better from their leaders, better from their intelligence services, and better from a system that claimed to value their lives while sending them into situations where their survival was considered less important than political convenience, Blackwood concluded. As you begin your careers as officers, remember that your first responsibility is always to the people under your command, and that sometimes fulfilling that responsibility requires courage that goes far beyond physical bravery. The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered, as if the audience wasn't sure whether they had witnessed an inspiring speech or a confession of institutional failure. Academy officials in the balcony were making increasingly urgent phone calls, clearly recognizing that their guest speaker had just created a public relations nightmare that would require immediate damage control. But Blackwood felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, the relief that comes from finally telling a truth that had been weighing on his conscience for far too long. Whatever consequences followed, he had at least honored the memory of the pilots who had died under his command and acknowledged the sacrifice of the one who had survived. As he left the podium and walked through corridors filled with portraits of Academy graduates who had gone on to distinguished careers in military service, Blackwood found himself thinking about the coffee shop in Georgetown, where Elena was waiting for answers that might well destroy what remained of his career. But for the first time in 15 years, the prospect of professional destruction felt less important than the possibility of redemption. The drive from Colorado Springs to Washington took most of the day, giving Blackwood time to consider the implications of what he had committed himself to by giving that speech. By now, transcripts would be circulating through Pentagon corridors, generating the kind of urgent meetings where careers were ended and official positions were coordinated. His phone had been buzzing continuously with calls from increasingly senior officials, but he had ignored them all, focusing instead on the road ahead and the conversation that awaited him. Uncommon Grounds.